Before I bring on today's last speaker of our World War I series, I want to acknowledge our donors. We've received funding from the New Jersey Historical Commission for our general operating budget, as well as for this lecture series. And we've also received funding from the Library of America through the Gilda Lehrman Institute of American History. Now I'm going to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Mark Van Ellis received his BA, MA, and PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he serves as the archivist historian at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum in Madison, Wisconsin. His research specialties include the social history of the United States military, World War II, immigration and ethnicity, and popular culture, and he's taught a wide range of courses on American, Asian, and European history. His other books include To Hear Only Thunder Again, America's World War II Veterans Come Home, and which is a study of veteran readjustment following the Second World War. His latest book is America, and I just happen to have right here upside down, America and World War I, A Traveler's Guide, which we have for sale in the gift shop, and I'm sure Mark will be happy to autograph it for you after the talk. He's currently writing a book on the history of the 32nd Infantry Division during World War II. Dr. Mark Van Ellis. Van Ells.
All right, thank you very much. Hoboken, as I'm sure you're all aware, is famous for many things. It is, of course, the birthplace of baseball. It's the birthplace of Old Blue Eyes. It's also where the famous film On the Waterfront was shot. I have to admit, the first time I ever came to Hoboken, I came here to see Carlo's Bakery. Sorry, my daughter had a thing for the Cake Boss, and I like cannoli, so it seemed like the thing to do. So on a very, very hot summer day, we came here to visit. One thing Hoboken's not so famous for anymore, but once was the fact that this was the major embarkation port for American troops heading to France during the First World War. So everyone around the country certainly knew the name Hoboken. The American Doughboys, as troops were known at the time, certainly knew about Hoboken as well. There was a very popular saying among the American troops in France. They wanted to be home by quote unquote, I'm sorry, I screwed that up. They talked about being home, going to heaven, hell, or Hoboken by Christmas. And what they meant by that basically was, of course, they wanted to get the war over with as soon as possible, and they knew when the war was over, they would end up in one of those three places. So this is a very notable place during the First World War. So what I want to do this afternoon is talk about the American port of embarkation here in Hoboken during the First World War. And it wasn't just in Hoboken, I should point out, either. There were many other places in the area that served as part of the embarkation facilities. And my book is also, it's not just a history of the American experience in the First World War, it's also meant to be a travel guide. I'm one of those people who can never pass up looking at a monument, as my family, much to their chagrin, will attest to. So I also wanted to sort of string together many of the places, historic sites, monuments, these sorts of things related to the First World War for the centennial. And there are several in this area as well. There's the famous, there's the monument I'm sure you all know at the foot of First Street, but there are many others as well. So if this presentation seems like Uncle Joe's slide presentation from his vacation, I will apologize, but I did write a history and I wrote a travel guide as well. All right, see if I can make this work. Here we go. So to understand why Hoboken became the major port of embarkation, of course, you have to understand that this is part of the largest and most significant port in the United States of America, if not the entire Western Hemisphere, and that, of course, is New York Harbor. It's deep, it's big. New York City was America's largest city, so just vast amounts of freight came through this port. All of the goods from the heartland came through this port on their way overseas. Of course, this is where where most immigrants and passengers came through. So just by far, New York was the largest port. And then the New Jersey docks were particularly important for freight, commerce, these sorts of things. All the rail lines from the interior of the country snaked eastward across the Appalachians and ended up meeting the waterfront here in New Jersey. So places like Hoboken, Jersey City, Newark, places like this, these were all major commercial centers and shipping centers for commerce as well as for passenger ships as well. Hoboken in particular was known for being a major passenger center and for German passenger lines in particular. As early as the 1850s, the Hamburg America line had set up shop here in Hoboken. Of course, New York was very, very crowded. This offered cheaper opportunities. North German Lloyd, a firm from Bremen, set up shop here as well. And right along the waterfront was where these major passenger liners had their docks, all the other operations that they do. So this was a major entry point for Germans in particular, passengers as well as immigrants. And in fact, Hoboken, and I'm sure other speakers talked about this in the other lectures in the series here, this was a remarkably German town. When you think of the most German cities in America, typically you come across Milwaukee, St. Louis, Cincinnati, but Hoboken was every bit as German. Probably 20 to 25% of people in this town spoke German. It was commonly heard in the streets of Hoboken. There were all kinds of restaurants and delicatessens that catered to a German population. And of course, where you find Germans, you find taverns, and there were plenty of those in Hoboken as well. River Street, at the time of the First World War, reportedly had 42 taverns, which might seem like a lot to a lot of people, but if you know Germans, it's really not that many at all. There were lots of German social clubs, from singing societies to shooting clubs, literary societies, and this was a remarkably German place. And Germans, I might point out, during this period were a pretty well-accepted immigrant group. Germans, of course, had been in America for a very long time, since colonial days. As immigrants went, the German population was rather prosperous, and many had gone on to become leading figures in business and industry and politics and things like this. German culture was rather similar to the Anglophone culture of Americans. So Germans were not an unfamiliar people. They seemed to contribute to American society. They fit in pretty well. And yet there was also a little suspicion of the Germans as well. Some natives complained that they didn't learn English fast enough, that they didn't seem to want to assimilate. And Germany was also a rising power at this time as well. So Germany seemed to represent something perhaps a little more threatening to Americans than, let's say, Italy or Slovenia or someplace like this. So Germans were accepted, and yet there did seem to be an undercurrent of suspicion and concern, and of course, oops, I screwed this up. In April 1917, those tensions, they came to the forefront. Now, without getting into the whole big story about how America got involved in the First World War, basically speaking, we had stronger economic ties to the Allies than we did to Germany and the Central Powers. The British Navy controlled the seas, and so our trade was cut off with Germany, but Britain and France certainly wanted to buy lots of stuff from us. The Germans, of course, tried to cut off that trade with submarine warfare. And long story short, we tried to stay out of the European war for 3 years, but in April of 1917, we enter the conflict. And this is going to raise some considerable concerns for Germans in America and for Hoboken in particular. There was a great concern about German sabotage, what we might today call terrorism. And I should point out right away that the vast majority of German immigrants in this city and across the country were American first and German second, but there were some again, concerns out there and some reason to be concerned. There were some episodes of violence that were linked to Germany. Many of you might be familiar with the famous Black Tom explosion that took place in July of 1916. This was an island then off the coast of Jersey City. It was a place where many of the munitions that we were selling to Britain and France were stockpiled before they were sent off to Europe. And one night at 2:08 a.m., there was a massive explosion. It damaged the Statue of Liberty. It blew out windows in Manhattan. Something like 26 people were killed. There was a lesser known incident that took place in Lyndhurst, New Jersey. There was a place called the Canadian Car and Foundry Company. They were making artillery shells for the Allies, and one day in January of 1917, it blew up as well. So there were artillery shells blowing up along the New Jersey Meadowlands. Both of these were eventually linked to Germany. So there was some concern about German espionage, German sabotage, these sorts of things, which of course would not be a good thing for Hoboken's German population. Now across the river as well, there were concerns. New York City, of course, the major port, most important city, and there was a great concern that maybe German saboteurs could poison the water supply heading into New York City, or maybe cut off the water supply by blowing up the aqueducts. So there was a group of part-time soldiers, you might say, who were tasked with protecting the aqueducts. Now the National Guard, of course, had been mobilized and sent to France, but there were lots of home guard units that you found all across the country, including, of course, in New York. They were mostly made up of teenage boys who were too young to serve in the army, and middle-aged men who were too old to serve in the army. Like me, I suppose, this maybe would have been me back in these days. And so they patrolled along the aqueducts, the Croton Aqueduct, the Catskill Aqueduct, looking for potential sabotage and nefarious activity. They never did catch a saboteur. They did report some suspicious incidents. There were times when shots were fired, but they never actually caught anyone. There were 40 deaths, however, in this unit. It was called the 1st Provisional Regiment. 40 of them died mostly of influenza. As I'm sure many of you are aware, World War I corresponded with this great influenza epidemic. So 40 died mostly of the flu. There were a few accidental shootings, and there was one poor guy that got hit by a train. So there were some risks to doing this as well. One young man died. It was in December of 1918, and he came from a rather poor family, and his family could not afford to bury him. So in Sleepy Hollow, New York, there's a famous family called the Rockefellers. You've probably heard of them before. William Rockefeller heard this tear-jerking story. He decided that he would donate some land in the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery to bury this young man. And of course, the members of the unit were very grateful, and they wanted to establish a monument for the others who perished during the First World War. So they built this monument and erected it near the young man's grave in the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. These home guard units have largely been forgotten about today, but this is one of the few monuments to them that you can find across the country. And they're still not forgotten today, I should point out. The first Sunday in May every year, they have a ceremony honoring them, which is today. I didn't get to go, I guess, but this must have happened this morning. So there was this concern about things blowing up, that we might not be able to trust the Germans here. And as I said before, that did not bode well for Hoboken. But Hoboken also presented the government with some important opportunities. Again, you had these German shipping lines with their docks here. You had big sheds, you had big warehouses, passenger terminals, all these sorts of things owned by these German companies. Now, also in Hoboken here, within the grounds of these shipping companies, You also had lots of German ships. When the war broke out, it was not safe for these German ships to make their way back to Europe because, of course, they might be sunk or captured by the British. So they basically spent the war in New York and Hoboken in particular, including a very large German passenger liner called the Vaterland, or Fatherland, as we would say in English. These docks, these ships were just sitting there. We've got to send troops over to Europe. And so the government pretty quickly put 2 and 2 together, and they decided to confiscate the yards and confiscate the ships and turn this into the major embarkation point for American troops heading over to France. So there was what you might call the invasion of Hoboken that took place on April the 19th of 1917. There were 3 companies of soldiers that came over from Governor's Island, and they appeared early one morning at the docks, and they basically took over the facilities. They took over the ships. The Vaterland, for example, this was renamed the Leviathan, and it was turned into a troop transport. So once a German ship now starts to send troops over to Europe to go fight Germany. But this became a very significant ship sending men to Europe. And of course, the docks became a very important place where the troops would be gathered, boarded on the ships, and then sent over to Europe. Sorry, just give me one sec. So very quickly, the government moved in, took over the buildings. Now, the buildings were oftentimes in disrepair. They had not been operating very much for the previous 3 years because of the British blockade. So the government had to clear out lots of old furniture, cargo. In the newspapers, they oftentimes noted that there were lots of big barrels of beer that were waiting for reshipment back to Germany. But all those sorts of things were cleared out, and very quickly the government starts to move in and turn this into the Troop Embarkation Center. The first troops to leave Hoboken bound for Europe was the 4th Base Hospital out of Cleveland, Ohio. They left on May the 8th of 1917. That's 100 years ago tomorrow, and that's just a few weeks after we moved in here. The regiments that became the first division, one of the most celebrated combat units over in France, they left here in June of 1917. So it didn't take too long for the government to transform this into a troop facility. And the German population in the town, well, this did raise some concerns among military officials. Anti-German sentiment was quite high. There was a great deal of suspicion of the Germans. I'll read for you, for example, the report of one American army officer who was stationed here at Hoboken. These are his views of the Germans. Here's what he wrote, quote, "Along River Street, where the old Bock beer signs of the German occupation still marked the Deutsche Gartens und Kursaals, tramped the men." These, of course, are the men heading to the ships going to France. Fat German saloon keepers and their Fraus and Fräuleins looked askance at this new invasion. Their Kaiser said that America would never enter the war, that troops would never sail the seas, and now, only a few weeks after our declaration of hostilities, an army was in motion. Something was wrong in the firm of me and Gott. So that sort of gives you a sense of the way the German population here was viewed. They were very concerned about spies and saboteurs, and in fact, foreign nationals, enemy aliens as they were called, they were not allowed anywhere near the docks at all. And in fact, in 1917, there were several raids across Hoboken to basically clear these people out of town. There was one that occurred in November of 1917 where they rounded up 200 people. I have here a clipping from the New York Times, and I'll read you a little excerpt from this as well to give you a sense how this operation played out. Quote, "The detachment of about 50 soldiers landed at one of the government docks about 8 o'clock. They separated in sections of 4, and with rifles on their shoulders started to search the street. The soldiers went into stores, rooming houses, and stopped men on the streets, but the greater number of those seized were found in saloons. Of course they were, right? The soldiers asked every man whether or not he was a citizen. Those who satisfied the soldiers that they were citizens were permitted to go. Those who could not give proof or who did not claim to be citizens were hurried away to Ellis Island. So they're literally rounding people up and they're incarcerating them and shipping them off because there was this great concern that the German population was going to be a problem for the military operations that took place here. So for Hoboken's German population, the First World War was a disaster, as was the case across the country, I should point out. A lot of people dropped their German names, stopped identifying themselves as Germans. The Gemütlichkeit that existed in a place like Hoboken was pretty much destroyed by the First World War, never really to return. But the Army had its transportation center now. And of course, the main goal was to send men to France. And we really had to raise an army from scratch. We were remarkably unprepared for the war. President Wilson, from 1914 to 1916, genuinely wanted to stay out of it. He was afraid that making too many moves of preparedness were going to be provocative. The way it turned out, of course, we ended up going to war with a very small army. The U.S. Army was at about 120,000 men. By contrast, there's 40,000 police officers in New York City, so it's a remarkably small number. There were another 80,000 National Guard troops who were at various levels of preparedness, but none of them were particularly well prepared. So we really had to raise an army from scratch. The draft begins in May of 1917. The first call-ups come that summer, and a whole host of training camps is opened up across the United States. There were 32 of them in all. There were 16 for National Guard troops. They were mostly tent camps in the southern United States. And then there were another 16 camps that were for draftees in various places across the country. Here's just a few of them, some of course quite far away. Camp Lewis, Washington, near Seattle. This is today's Fort Lewis. You have Camp Cody in New Mexico, just a stretch of desert today. A little museum there commemorates that camp. All across the South, of course, Georgia, Mississippi, Kentucky, areas like this, and not too far from here either, I should point out. Camp Dix, which is now Fort Dix, which is actually now, it's the Dix Lakehurst McGuire Joint Base, I think it's called. It's all combined now with the Navy and the Air Force and things like this. But that began with the First World War as a training camp for U.S. soldiers. And Camp Upton on Long Island out in Suffolk County also began that way as well. So these training camps were located across the country, and they very quickly had to turn civilians into soldiers. Ideally, they were supposed to be trained for 6 months. The way it worked out in actuality, especially towards the end of the war, is that they were basically brought to these camps. They were given a uniform, a rifle, a few weeks of training, and then sent to France. I mean, there were literally some units in France that had not been in uniform for more than 6 months before they were actually in battle. So they really rushed things quite a bit. And all these men had to be transported from various places across the country to the East Coast and New York and Hoboken in particular. So you can imagine the train traffic, all the trains heading in this direction. Now this, of course, was a very, very patriotic time. A lot of people wanted to show their support for the troops, and so if you read the soldiers' memoirs, their trips to Hoboken, they oftentimes describe big parades and celebrations. Here's how one soldier described his voyage to the East Coast, quote, "Every whistle and bell within miles was playing tunes. People crowded in windows of houses and factories. Everyone's hat was off. Everyone was yelling himself hoarse. Red Cross ladies at every station with apples and cigarettes." Can you imagine that? Passing out free cigarettes today. "Pretty girls shaking hands with us through the car windows. I am still quite drunk of the excitement of it. The most touching sight was the intense patriotism old people displayed. Time and again, we would see an old, bent, gray-haired woman waving a great flag at us, or an old man swinging his hat and cheering. So they really had this celebratory time on their way. It was a very long trip, of course, and I might add, sometimes they did get off the train, not just for calisthenics, but to see the sights as well. So it could be a very long trip from California or Washington State to New York Harbor, but they made it. And here are some of a chart here to give you a sense of what how the shipping proceeded from 1917 up to the end of 1918. You can see through 1917, not very many people are making their way to France because we don't really have any soldiers yet. But by 1918, the numbers begin to pick up pretty dramatically. Troop shipments overseas peaked in the summer of 1917. What we got here? July of 1918, 306,000 troops made their way in that month alone. That's basically 10,000 a day. That's an infantry division every 2.5 days, essentially. So you get a sense of the sort of business that these ports were doing in shipping these men overseas. Again, it was a really difficult thing to get all the transports ready. Half of them went over in British ships, about half went over in American ships. And just the logistics of getting all these people in the right place at the right time to send them overseas was a very difficult task. And the vast majority of them came through New York, but what I really mean, of course, is Hoboken. So here's another chart here to give you a sense of the different ports of embarkation. The second most important port was Newport News, Virginia, and that was the only one that was really anywhere close to Hoboken. And of course, there were many other ports as well. From Canada, of course, Canada had been in the war for much longer than we had, so they already had the infrastructure up there. Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, places like this. But of the 2 million Americans who went overseas, 1.6 million at least, and I was talking with someone earlier, there are other figures, but these are the official government figures, right? 1.6 million, more than 75% of them went through New York Harbor, again, meaning, of course, Hoboken, to give you a sense of just how many soldiers were going through this particular port on their way to what they then called the Great War. And you had to warehouse them somewhere. You all live in Hoboken, right? It's crowded. I can tell you there's nowhere to park. I've learned that several times, including tonight. So where are we going to put all these troops? Well, the government had thought of this as well, and there were several embarkation camps that were established in the New York area. The largest and most significant of them was a place called Camp Merritt. It was named after John Wesley Merritt. He was a Civil War hero. And this is located in Bergen County. It's right on the border between Cresskill and Dumont. So it's 10 miles north of here, something like that. And this was massively huge. It covered 770 acres. The camp at its peak by the end of 1918 was a mile long. It stretched 1 mile up and down Knickerbocker Road and almost a mile wide, about 3/4 of a mile wide. Here's some figures real quickly. There were 611 two-story barracks buildings, a corresponding 189 lavatories. They have to go somewhere, right? 165 kitchens. You have to feed all those young men. So this was warehousing for these troops heading over to France. They really didn't have terribly much to do, really. They got a physical, another physical. They replaced old equipment that may have worn out during training. Sometimes these soldiers, they did get some overseas equipment. This, for example, is where they got their gas mask. They got their steel helmets and things like this. So they're preparing them for embarkation. But that really didn't take up all that much time. And so there were also lots of recreational facilities for for the men at Camp Merritt as well. There were something like 7 YMCA huts across the facility. Now, these, of course, are the days before the USO that we know that comes from World War II. So the YMCA was sort of the major, there were several groups, but the YMCA was the major one, sort of looking out for the welfare of the troops. And there were 7 of these huts across the facility. There was a big recreation hall where you could write a letter, play games. They even offered French lessons, since most of them are going to France, and so there were plenty of ways for them to try and stay busy. They spent about a week there. Camp Merritt, by all accounts, was not an unpleasant place to be if you're a soldier. One soldier remarked that it was probably the nicest camp in the entire United States. It was fairly comfortable, they had leisure time, and yet you also have to imagine that these men are preparing to go overseas. They're about to leave their families. Camp Merritt, in fact, and the other camps were oftentimes inundated with family members who wanted to say one last goodbye to their loved ones. I'll also add, by the way, that there was also a major problem with going AWOL. And if you're not familiar with military terminology, that's absent without leave. Soldiers would oftentimes simply take off for various reasons. Some simply did not want to go to war, obviously. Some wanted to sneak off for one last visit with their family. Now the troops at, I'll come back to this one, I guess. Oh, no, I goofed up my order, I'm sorry. Let me go back. Here, so since we're here, let's do this. The troops also got a little bit of leisure time as well, and they got a chance to go to New York City. Who wouldn't want to go to New York City if you're from Wichita, Kansas, right? Now, the Army during World War II really looked after the morals of the troops. They were very concerned about them getting their hands on alcohol. Keep in mind that these are the days when Prohibition is brewing, no pun intended. Thank you for that. So they really had, they policed their morals. It was, you could not sell beer to a soldier in uniform. You could not have taverns open within something like a half a mile of a military base or something like this. But New York, of course, is way too big to really patrol, right? So the troops went into town. Now, many were nice boys who simply wanted to see the sights, and they went to Central Park and Wall Street and whatever the tourist facilities happened to be. Some, however, were looking for a little fun. Might find some rum, some demon rum. Maybe not in Manhattan, where things might have been, they were being monitored. Coney Island had a reputation for being a place where you might be able to get your hands on some booze. And so many of those who were AWOL, they simply came in late from their passes, basically. So people went AWOL for various reasons at the camps here, but not a bad place to be. So if I can go back here now. Dang it. I was not in the AV club, as you can tell. Here we go. So from Camp Merritt, the soldiers mostly took the train from Cresskill or Dumont stations down to Hoboken. But there were some troops who took a ferry. They marched about 3 miles from the camp to Alpine Landing in the New Jersey Palisades. Not a bad march if you're a soldier. 3 miles is not so bad. So down what's now the Closter Dock Trail in the Palisades Park, and down to the waterfront here. Here are some pictures of what this looks like today. This is the mouth of the trail that heads down to the waterfront. And the house you see there, this is an 18th century farmhouse. The soldiers were told that this was General Cornwallis's headquarters during the American Revolution. And of course the soldiers, they're very patriotic. They like this connection between themselves and the founding fathers. Unfortunately, and they didn't know this of course, but unfortunately Cornwallis probably never set foot in the house. He probably invaded New Jersey at a different spot, but it made them feel patriotic, certainly. So at Alpine Landing, they would then hop a ferry, and this would take them down to Hoboken. The train lines were full, and they're running constantly, and this was another way to sort of handle the overflow of men heading down to the docks here at Hoboken. Now, when the war was over, Camp Merritt became a return center. So many returned to the very same camp that they had left at the beginning of the war. And it was finally closed in 1920. After which they sold off many of the buildings. A very, very few of them are still around. They're not marked, at least not to my knowledge, but there's a restaurant right on Knickerbocker Road called the Hungry Peddler, and I'm told this was a leftover building from the war that was then sold off and still in use today. In the early 1920s, much of the remnants of the camp caught on fire. Whether it was through vandalism or accidents, I mean, fires can start in various reasons. There were several waves of fires, in fact, and what had not been sold off basically burned to the ground. Now, in 1924, they built this monument in the center, what was then the center of the camp, which I think few people probably visit, but I think it's worth a visit, certainly. The sculptures on the monument were designed by a man named Robert Aiken. If you know your art history, he's a very famous Art Deco sculptor of the time. He did the pediments of the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., and he did work on the National World War I Memorial in Kansas City as well. Well, he did these bas-reliefs here as well. And on the monument are also the names of more than 500 American soldiers who died there, mostly of the flu. Again, this was the influenza epidemic, so when it ravaged a camp, it really did a number. Again, more than 500 died there. Their numbers are on that monument. So if you get up there and if you can find the parking spots, and it's easier to park there than it is here, I certainly would recommend you have a look at that. That's like the last remnant you can find of Camp Merritt. You can find the name Merritt and the name Pershing and things like this in the area, but there's virtually nothing left of that camp anymore today. So Camp Merritt was a very important place, but it still wasn't enough to house the massive numbers of soldiers coming to New York Harbor. So another facility was opened up on Long Island in Nassau County, and this is a place called Camp Mills. It's in what's now Garden City, New York, not far from the Roosevelt Field Mall. That's sort of the landmark for people on Long Island, but right near there. There already was an Army airfield there. They're training pilots. So there's an open plot of ground, and so they decided to put this transit camp there as well. It opened in 1917, and it was originally meant to be temporary. It was the 42nd Division that staged there on their way overseas. And if you know your World War I history, this was the so-called Rainbow Division. It was a National Guard unit composed of units from all across the country. It was said that it stretched across the country like a rainbow, hence the name. Among its famous commanders was a man named Douglas MacArthur, who of course not only gained fame in the First World War, but gained fame, some would say infamy, in the Second World War as well. So one of the most interesting figures in military history, certainly. Well, this was their temporary camp. And then when the 42nd Division left, the 41st Division came in. And by this time now, it's November of 1917, and the weather's getting colder, and the men of the 41st Division were quite miserable at Camp Mills. Here's one account from a soldier in that unit, quote, "The tents were without floors and cold and chill without stoves. The Battery Street was a series of puddles. The kitchen was a shed open on four sides through which the wind carried the cold drizzling rain, soaking the cooks, the food, and the fire, which smoked dismally in the cold gray dawn. Did you ever try rain-soaked cornflakes for your morning cereal? There were other things, but why multiply the miseries?" So clearly, he's not happy with things at Camp Mills. And it was so unsatisfactory, in fact, that after the 41st Division left, they closed it. And by this time, Camp Merritt was open as well, so there didn't seem to be much of a need for it. But in April of 1918, they reopened Camp Mills. This time you can see with more permanent buildings, some wooden structures and these sorts of things, and they tried to make the place more commodious. It certainly was better after April of 1918, but in stark contrast to Camp Merritt, the soldiers just couldn't stop complaining about Camp Mills. They complained about the heat, they complained about the cold, they complained about the mosquitoes. I don't know if they just got a bad bunch of soldiers there or if that camp really was that much worse than Camp Merritt, but it was not a popular place to be for many of these troops. And even this was still not enough. So Camp Dix, which was a training camp, this also served as an embarkation center. Several thousand troops were warehoused there before they brought them up to the Hoboken docks. And Camp Upton on Long Island also served as an embarkation center as well as a training facility as well. So they needed to find lots of places to house these 10,000 troops a day, and that was not an easy task, but they did manage to accomplish the job. And Camp Mills, by the way, here again, there's not really much left of the facility. There is one monument to the 42nd Division you can find there, sort of in the shadow of the Roosevelt Field Mall, if you look real carefully. This is mostly a housing subdivision today. Virtually no, and a couple of historical markers I might add as well, and virtually no indication that this large camp ever existed there. So this is a map of New York Harbor and the operations of sending men overseas. Hoboken was the center of it all, but there were several other facilities as well, because again, the piers here at Hoboken were not enough to send over all those troops. So, for example, Chelsea Piers in Manhattan, directly across the river from here. This was also converted into a troop transport facility. The Lusitania you may be familiar with, that's the famous ship that was sunk in 1917. It took off from Pier 54. Well, just north of that is where the Army also commandeered some piers to send men overseas. And the Bush Terminal docks in Brooklyn. This is now what we call Industry City. The Bush Terminal Company was a major shipping concern. The government took over their facilities and they used that for troop transport as well. Oftentimes what happened is that men were brought down to Hoboken, and then from Hoboken they were put on ferries and sent across New York Harbor to Chelsea Piers or to Brooklyn. So still, most of these men were passing through Hoboken, although many from Long Island did end up going directly to Chelsea Piers or Bush Terminal. But it was a major operation. It covered a very large area, a very large region of the tri-state area. The commander of this operation was General David Shanks. And overall, he commanded probably 20,000 troops. And not just in Hoboken, I should say. That 20,000 figure, that includes the regular Army who were stationed at Camp Merritt or Camp Mills. Shanks was also responsible for the troop transport operations out of Boston, Philadelphia, those sorts of areas as well. So his domain was quite considerable. A little bit about Shanks real quickly. He was a career Army officer. He was stationed in Manila in the Philippines when the war broke out, and he was summoned back to America. And Shanks had the hope, as many career Army officers did, that he was on his way to France. And he was quite disappointed to find out that what the government actually wanted him to do was to run the Embarkation port. So he was quite dissatisfied with that. You know, again, if you're a career Army officer, you want to get in on the action. Now, there's no biography that I know of Shanks. That I'm not entirely clear why he was denied a combat assignment. I will say that he was born in 1861. He's approaching 60 years old. And so I suspect age probably had a factor, that his superiors decided he was not physically fit, physically capable of commanding troops in the field. He must also have had a very great reputation as an administrator. And in modern war, you know, those desk jockeys, those pencil pushers are really important people, of course, and they serve too. So whatever the case may be, Shanks ended up commanding the embarkation operations out of New York Harbor. He complained quite a bit that he could never really find quality officers to help him out. Of course, all the other officers wanted to go to France as well, but he was a good soldier. He saluted, he did his duty, and he ran the operations quite smoothly and quite well. Again, just imagine the logistics of organizing all these things. And in fact, he even had a sense of humor about it as well. He found it interesting to see all these troops from all across the country coming to New York and passing through the ports. And many, of course, came from places where they had, most American troops had never been farther than their hometown, had never seen an ocean before. Shanks found some humor in this. Here's a little excerpt from his World War I memoir. Quote, "It is likely that much of the greater part of our boys had never before been on a ship. Probably a majority had never seen an ocean-going vessel. How crude the ideas of some of these young country lads may be surmised from the fact that occasionally considerable numbers of them on a ferry to the Brooklyn Pier would suppose that they were already off to France and would make anxious inquiries as to the probable date of their arrival." So they didn't quite get that they're just going across the river, of course. So he found some humor in his assignment as well. And I'll add real quickly, by the way, and his contributions did not go unnoticed and unremarked either. In World War II, in Rockland County, New York, there was a major embarkation center for that war, and it's named Camp Shanks. So he did get his due later on, of course. Someone recognized what he had done anyway. But it was his responsibility to shepherd all these men through the port. So you can imagine what the docks of Hoboken must have looked like, especially in 1918, when the troop shipments really begin to when they really begin to pick up. Now, I should say that most of these troops really actually saw very little of Hoboken itself. They were here for more than 24 hours, basically. They were brought in by train, typically coming through the train station you still see down there today. They also built the spur into the yards themselves. So they got off the train, and then they were marched to the docks. Here I have another quote from a soldier about his arrival in Hoboken to give you a sense of the way the soldiers perceived it. Quote, "Our marching through Hoboken caused little excitement. These people were fed up with seeing soldiers. Suddenly we were at the docks, with great dazzle-painted ships lying at every side. An ocean liner always gives one a thrill, but oh, the thrill of seeing at last the boat that would take us to France after 4 months training for this sight." Right, so you can imagine the anticipation, the fear, these sorts of things of walking onto the deck. But yet their interactions with Hoboken citizens themselves were quite minimal. In fact, the impact on Hoboken of the port of embarkation itself is quite mixed. When you look at the First World War, communities across the country were begging the government to set up military facilities in their communities. Some places actually purchased land and donated it to the army so they could get a camp, because they expected, of course, soldiers to come and spend money and things like this. That was not the case with Hoboken. If anything, the war really diminished Hoboken economically. Of course, once the shipping is stopped, and this happened even before we entered the war in 1917, closing those docks is already not going to be good for business. The troops did not spend much time here at all. Many of the businesses, again, most notably the taverns, were closed. So the war actually, this makes Hoboken famous, of course, but it probably did not help the economy all that much. And may have begun Hoboken's long slide through much of the 20th century, a deterioration of the port and the town until renovated in the later 20th century. So it might not have the positive impact that you might expect and that other towns certainly experienced. Now, boarding the ship, of course, this was a complicated operation as well, but it was done with military efficiency. Troops were lined up in alphabetical order. Let me take a step back. I don't know how many of you have any military experience, but you may have heard the term hurry up and wait. Oh, yeah. This was largely the experience of these soldiers. They're awakened early in the morning to get on the train or take the ferry from Alpine Landing. They're brought down here, they're herded like cattle into the big waiting areas, and then they're told, hold on, boys. And so many were quite annoyed by that, as you can probably imagine. Now, there were Red Cross ladies who were passing out, again, free cigarettes and hot coffee and drinks and refreshments of various kinds, and so that was certainly popular with the men. But they are eventually formed up, lined up in alphabetical order, so you can imagine the scene. The sergeant calls your name, you set your foot on the gangplank, and you walk up that deck onto the ship, not exactly knowing if you're ever going to come back again. And in fact, 75,000 Americans died overseas, either through combat or through disease and accidents of various kinds. And these men were certainly aware that there was this possibility that they weren't coming back. So you can imagine the bittersweet feelings, leaving your family, and yet the excitement of going off to war. And those who study World War I will tell you these guys really were gung-ho. Unlike World War II, where many were sort of reluctant warriors, once America made the decision, they were into it. Right? So many really were keyed up to go, and yet there was that tug in your throat at the same time. So you get onto the ship, you get to your quarters. Officers, of course, had more room than enlisted men. Enlisted men typically warehoused below the waterline, no view, no air conditioning as we know it, these sorts of things, very cramped conditions. And then there was eventually the time to depart. And here again, you can imagine those mixed feelings as well. Sometimes the men were forced to stay below decks. The concern was maybe German spies would count how many men were on the ship and relay this information back to Germany somehow. But there were also many troops who reported pulling out of New York Harbor standing on the deck. And if there's one thing that caught their attention as they're pulling out of New York Harbor, it was the Statue of Liberty. This was, with those soldiers who got a pass in New York, this was often the first thing that they went to go see, as it is true for many tourists to New York City today. And when they left the port, that statue took on immense significance. Let me read you another quote here from a soldier. "The Statue of Liberty never looked so glorious to us as it did before on this memorable occasion. This bronze lady, the Queen of the Harbor, seemed very lifelike to us as she watched our departure, telling us in no uncertain terms what she expected of us." So again, that patriotic feeling, that sense of going, that's the mixed feelings. Many soldiers report going below decks, and once you're out of sight, having a good cry. If you can imagine really tough, strong soldiers doing that, it oftentimes did happen. So individual results, of course, will differ, but they were off. As I said before, something like 75,000 would not come back, but the war ends in November of 1918. And if you recall the chart I showed you earlier, troops begin to come back almost immediately. Right? The very first question on soldiers' minds once the war was over was, when do I get to go home? And the Army was pretty good about bringing them back fairly quickly, arguably too quickly, because once the men got home, they flooded the job market and it caused lots of economic problems and demobilization problems. In World War II, they spaced them out a bit to avoid these sorts of things. But then the men started to come home. And of course, the Statue of Liberty then also took on very great proportions as well, having survived the war. And again, then it's simply retracing your steps. Get off the boat at Hoboken, get on the train and head up to Camp Merritt. Spend maybe a week there on processing, then get on a train and head back to Camp Cody or Camp Lewis or Camp Gordon or whatever the case may be. Many men, in fact, found themselves being discharged from the very same place where they received their basic training. And again, keep in mind that all of this happened within a span of 18 months. That's a year and a half. So this massive operation was organized from scratch, shipped more than 2 million men overseas, 1.6 million from this harbor alone, brought them all back in a remarkably quick fashion. what did happen here in Hoboken in the First World War really was quite remarkable. And when the Second World War came, the federal government would learn some lessons of where we did things well, and of course where we screwed things up as well. But it would set a very important precedent for the Second World War that unfortunately came just 10 years later. So after the war, these memorials were constructed. The one I showed you at Camp Mills, the one up at Camp Merritt. And here's probably a familiar sight to everyone in this room, I suspect, as well. This was placed in the 1920s, 1925, if I recall correctly. It was on River Street for a while. Now, you guys are I don't live here. I'm just a visitor.
It's been moved around.
They moved it to 2003. They moved it to its current location. Yes, but it's a familiar landscape in Hoboken. So, of course, lots of people come to Hoboken today, tourists from across the river. They want to go follow in Blue Eye's footsteps and go to Elysian Fields. And I was jeered when I mentioned the Cake Boss. I'm a little afraid to mention that again there. But some people come for that too. But when people do come to Hoboken, they oftentimes will come across this monument. In fact, I'll tell you my story. My first trip to Hoboken here was probably 5-6 years ago, something like this, a while ago. And we're standing in line at Carlo, that place. And it was a remarkably, brutally hot day. And I decided, with permission, of course, that I was going to go for a walk around town. I was aware of that this was the port of Embarkation. I, in fact, had a relative in the First World War. I knew he shipped out of here. He was killed, so he didn't come back this way, but I know he left here, so I had always wanted to see the place. And I was getting impatient for my cannoli. So I took a walk, and I walked down to the waterfront, and I came across the monument. In fact, I took this picture on that day. And at the time, I had been thinking, you know, there ought to be a book about all these World War I monuments somewhere. You just walk around and you bump into them. Someone ought to do that someday. Now, I had seen other World War I monuments as well, but the one I saw here in Hoboken was one of the major seeds of the book that I eventually wrote. So Hoboken inspired me to do this book. And I hope that you will not only see this monument, but also maybe take a drive up to Camp Merritt, or I know Long Island seems like the moon, but if you get over there, you can stop in and see Camp Mills, the Brooklyn Army Terminal, these sorts of things as well. There are lots of World War I sites to see right here in our city, and this city and our metropolitan area, and I hope you'll do so. And thank you. There we go. Thank you.